All right, Heroes to Hive students. Today's lecture is going to be on early season management of overwintered hives. So you've gotten through the winter and you've got to know what to do with these beehives as we start to get out of winter and enter into spring. And you having overwintered hives, well, that's a good thing. You've been able to get those hives through the winter, and that is one of the toughest things to do as a beekeeper in modern times. Oftentimes, hives are lost at very high rates during the winter. It's not unusual to see, 50% losses for a lot of beekeepers. A lot of beekeepers will see 100% losses as well. And there's reasons for those losses, and we'll talk about those reasons later on in this course. But today we're going to focus on the hives that have made it through the winter and what do you do with those during this time. So I just wanted to touch on this real quick, just to kind of give you all a sense of where you're at in the season. So this is the overwintering cycle, very simplified. So you can see here, and I'll use my cursor here, but you can see here that we're right around in here. We're coming out of winter when we're entering spring. And really what you need to think about is that this whole process of getting hives through the winter really started last summer. And we'll talk about that in August later on in the course, but the summertime, that late summertime is a really important time to be able to make sure that your hives have enough provisions and that they're healthy enough to make it through winter. So just to take you through this life cycle here, and we'll start here in the summer. So this illustrates right here that we've got big production colonies. You can see that on these graphics here, lots of yellow represents lots of food in the hive. You can see that we have emerging bees here, and that we also have eggs. So that means that brood is being reared, brood is hatching, and food is on during that late part of the summer. But you can see as we enter fall, food resources are on very heavy, but there's a cessation from brood rearing. So during the fall, as we enter winter, brood rearing actually ceases. And so during the winter, the focus of the colony is really to maintain temperature, thermoregulation, and they do that by eating honey and burning calories. And so as we look up here, you can see that this graphic right here shows that we've got a cluster of bees down there in the brood chamber. Those bees are clustering together to stay warm. And then as we get through winter, we start to see at some point the queen will start laying eggs again. And that's usually after we see kind of a warm-up period. Now, for those of us here in Michigan, this can vary greatly. Those of you that are in the lower peninsula, especially the lower peninsula down near the southern border of the state, many of you have already seen brood rearing coming on very, very heavy this season at this time. But for those of us that live in the upper peninsula, I'm looking outside of my window right now, and we still have quite a lot of snow coming down. So we are not really seeing that up here. So this is very temperature and regional dependent. Those of you that are out of state in southern states or in California, I know when I was in California, generally, we didn't really see a lot of slowdown from brood rearing, mainly because we really didn't have cold temperatures. So it varies depending on where you're at. But essentially, as we come out of winter, we're going to start to see the queen start to lay eggs. And when that happens, things start to change quite a bit, and we'll discuss that. But as we get into coming into spring, you can see that we've got brood emerging. There's not a lot of food on the hive, so note that the food is being dwindled over the winter because they're using those food stores to maintain temperature. And so when we get out of the spring, we really are in a position where there's not a lot of food in the hive. But we have brood rearing happening. Now, we'll talk a little bit about how they're able to rear brood without access to things like pollen here in just a bit. And then we get into spring, and that's when we're off to splits. So we're going to kind of talk about kind of the whole course of this early part of the spring and what you should be thinking about during this time. What's happening outside? So this time of the year, things are changing. And one of the things that is really changing is day length is increasing and temperatures are rising. And those signals change things that are happening in the colony. So we start to see day length increasing, we start to see temperature rising, and those are signals for brood rearing. So when we start to see those temperatures come up in those longer day lengths, that's one of the signals for brood rearing. Now, also resource availability is also one of those signals as well. And in some places we have resources available right now, and other places we don't. Here in the Upper Peninsula, we're just starting to see soft maples start to push buds. Whereas in the lower peninsula, you likely already have things blooming in the landscape. So there are already resources out there. And those soft maples, being one of the earliest things that flowers, are a very important forage resource. They put off a lot of pollen, they have a nectar resource. So that is a really important resource for bees during this time of the year. What's happening inside the colony? Well, the colony has been feeding on honey stores this entire winter. And as they've gone through those honey stores that are located above the brood chamber, the location of the cluster has changed. So the bulk of bees that you had that originally started down in that brood chamber, they've been moving up, feeding on honey stores all season long. And a lot of you right now, as you open up your top covers and look in, what you'll see is a picture like we have over here, where you have this huge cluster of bees that has made it to the top of the boxes, at the top of your hive. And what that's an indication of is one, that they're running out of food. And you can see in this picture that we have supplemental sugar on top there. But two, you're getting to a situation where the cluster has moved location overall, and you're going to have to accommodate that somehow to relocate them back into the lower portion of the hive, so that we can start the whole cycle over again, where we have brood down in the bottom and we're storing resources on top. And we'll talk about how to do that here at the end of this lecture. The other thing to keep in mind is over this season, the bees have been putting off a tremendous amount of moisture. As they feed on honey stores, they respire, which is basically warm, moist air that's coming out of them. And so we have to mitigate that moisture. And over time, that moisture builds up very heavily inside of the colony. And so we have to manage that over the course of the winter and the spring. One thing I've been seeing on some posts recently on some of the beekeeping posts here sites here in Michigan is folks asking about taking off quilt boxes or taking off moisture boards. You do not need to take those off right now. And in fact, I would encourage you not, because the temperatures are very unstable this time of the year. And you could get into a situation where we have a prolonged cold snap come in over the course of, say, March or April. And you need to be able to have those moisture wicking devices still on, because those bees will recluster and you'll start to have moisture coming off of that cluster as they're trying to stay warm. So you want to make sure that your moisture is under control. It's not going to hurt the colony to leave it on a long time. I mean, you could leave it on into the summer and it's not going to matter at all. You definitely, at some point you're going to take it off, but I'm just trying to illustrate that it's something that is not critical to take off. It should be the last thing you're thinking about is how soon should I take off my quilt box? Don't get so hung up on things like that, or my moisture board. And in addition, what's happening inside right now is that brood rearing is beginning this time of the season. So we're getting those warm ups. We're starting to see brood coming on. Usually when things start to come on, it's not like we get a whole bunch of brood put on right at once. Usually in this time of the year, it's kind of a small patch of brood that they start with. But when that happens, and when brood rearing starts to come on, the priorities of the colony change altogether. So when brood is on, that whole idea of clustering as the priority of the hive, and kind of, well, I don't want to say it goes out the window, but they're focused on clustering around the brood. So the priority goes from keeping the cluster warm to making sure that the brood doesn't freeze out. And in order to make sure that brood doesn't freeze out, we need to keep that brood chamber around 95 degrees. So what that does is that the colony itself, since the priorities have changed, since it's not just about clustering, it's about keeping the brood warm, we actually run into situations this time of the year where folks have made it through the winter, they're feeling really confident about how things are going, and then we get a cold snap that comes in, and then the next thing you know, they open up their colonies after the cold snap and they're dead. Generally, that is due to what we call starvation in place. So as brood is put on and the priorities of the colony changes, you can run into a situation where if the colony has brood on and we hit a cold snap, that cluster will stay on that brood even though they have no access to food. So they may be clustered right around the brood, and you may have food, a couple frames away from them, and they will literally starve in place on that brood because they will not move to find food. The priority is keeping the brood warm. So when we have prolonged cold snaps where they cannot release from that brood and can't access food, you actually will get starvation in place. And what that looks like when you go back and do your autopsy, as you're cleaning out deadouts, is you'll see a cluster of bees around a small patch of brood, and you essentially will see maybe food, 2-3 frames away, or maybe if you don't have any food, maybe there's no food at all in there. But essentially, the food is out of reach of the cluster because the priority is keeping the brood warm. And that's something that is really important to understand. And I'm going to show you a technique to kind of help with this problem later on in this lecture. In addition, access to food is critical. So we need to make sure that we have honey still on the hive, or sugar, some sort of carbohydrate resource. So if you see a cluster like in the previous picture that's up near the top of the colony, that is an indication that they've run through honey stores, and you need to make sure you have supplemental sugar on at that point. This time of the year, I do not advocate feeding sugar water. It's a little too early for that in a lot of places. If you're in really warm climates, that obviously does not relate to you, but generally, I don't like to start feeding sugar until we're well out of freezing. Keeping, or sugar water, but keeping just granulated sugar on the hive during this time of the year is just fine, and is actually preferred. So you need to have a carbohydrate resource, and then you need to have a pollen resource as well. But there's something about pollen that confuses a lot of folks. I see a lot of folks that really are just waiting for any excuse to put a pollen patty on these hives this time of the year. Now, if you're in an area that's more temperate and things are kind of off to the races, you have big brood cluster, big brood coming on, that's one thing. The lower peninsula, we actually just started feeding in the lower peninsula, we just started feeding our MSU hives pollen patties this week. So we've seen that the temperatures down south have been and I'm in the upper peninsula, but the temperatures down south and the lower peninsula have been very odd this year. It's been a very mild winter. And so we're seeing brood start up a lot faster than we normally would. Normally, putting on pollen patties late March, early April is kind of normal, but we're kind of mid-March right now. So keep in mind that this is all temperature dependent. But here in the UP, where we still have, I'm just looking at 2 feet of snow outside of my office window, putting on pollen patties this early, not only is that dangerous because you're stimulating heavy brood production, and you get a big brood cluster. Now the priorities of that colony are, well, we have to maintain temperature of this entire brood cluster. So you want to be really, really careful about adding pollen too early. And we're going to talk about in this next slide why that is the case. And the case for that is the case for vitellogenin. So vitellogenin is a substance that is essentially, it's kind of like an egg yolk substance. It's high in lipids, it's high in protein, it's high in amino acids. And vitellogenin is this amazing compound that really has an incredible effect on honeybees. So vitellogenin levels are generally high when bees are nurse bees. When we have queens, they have a high vitellogenin level, and our winter bees have a high vitellogenin level. Our foragers, when a bee goes from being a nurse bee and turns to a forager and leaves the hive, their vitellogenin levels drop. Now, what is vitellogenin doing? So vitellogenin is actually, when we think about it as a compound, is the compound that is related to longevity. And that's the easiest way to understand this. The more vitellogenin you have in your body, the longer you are able to live. Queens have very high vitellogenin levels, and they live for years. Winter bees have very high vitellogenin levels. They live for months. Worker bees have very low vitellogenin levels, and after they leave the brood, or after they leave their role as a nurse bee, that vitellogenin level drops, and we generally see those individuals die within a couple weeks. So vitellogenin is the ability for longevity. It is also the compound that is critical to jelly production, jelly being the substance that's fed to young bees. So when we think about the health of our bees, if we have healthy bees going into the winter, when this time of the year comes around and brood rearing starts, vitellogenin actually, if they are healthy enough, they can produce enough vitellogenin to allow feeding of young brood. And that's how they feed brood before pollen is available, because they're feeding them this protein-rich substance, this egg yolk-like substance to the brood. Now, the caveat to this is that if your bees are not healthy, they cannot produce enough vitellogenin to support a brood chamber. So this all comes back to one factor. Well, and there's other extraneous factors, but one major factor: Varroa mites. So you're going to hear me harp about this all year long, is the importance of managing Varroa mites. Colonies that go into the fall with high Varroa mite levels will have compromised bees. And the thing that you need to understand is that Varroa mites feed on an organ called the fat body. It's underneath the abdominal segments, down at the base of the abdomen. And the fat body is kind of like our liver, but it has many more functions. So it detoxifies environmental contaminants, but it also is where vitellogenin is produced. And so a healthy fat body will produce lots of vitellogenin. And that vitellogenin basically creates all these fat stores in the bee that allows them to live for a very long time. In addition, that vitellogenin can be allocated to the hyperpharyngeal gland to be able to feed the young bees a protein-rich jelly. So if you have healthy bees, they will be able to handle this early part of the season just fine with the vitellogenin that they're producing to feed their young bees. They don't need you to add a protein supplement really, really early in the season. They can take care of it. But as soon as that brood chamber starts to expand, as soon as we get past kind of the ups and downs of the winter, you need to make sure that you start supplementing protein just so that they can really, really ramp up brood production. But you shouldn't be worried really early in the season about how am I going to get protein onto my bees, because your bees, if they are healthy, should be able to handle that themselves. So that's a little bit about vitellogenin. I encourage you to read more about vitellogenin. We don't have enough time to talk about all the amazing things that vitellogenin does. But the big thing to realize is that longevity is correlated with vitellogenin. The more vitellogenin you have, the longer you live. So that's why it is so important. And again, if you have a compromised fat body, that means that you can't put on those vitellogenin stores, those fat stores, during the winter. And that is what Varroa mite is compromising. They are feeding on the fat body, compromising the fat body, introducing viruses into the fat body. If that organ gets compromised, your bees have no chance. And that's why most folks that lose colonies before January, 90% of the time, it's due to Varroa mite. Why? Because they haven't been able to put on those vitellogenin fat stores, which means that if they can't produce vitellogenin, they have no ability to live a long time. So they die out very quickly. If they are healthy, they will live through that entire winter just fine. All right, so this next whole section of this talk is this 8-step process that you're going to be using as a plan for spring this year. So this, again, for Michigan beekeepers, we're talking March through June here. So we're going to go through, do your hives have food? We're going to talk about, is your moisture under control? Have your hives been wrapped this season and what that means? Have you ordered your bees? What are you doing about equipment right now? Are your deadouts cleaned out? What are you doing about swarm prevention? And thinking about splits. So we're going to go through all of this. And this is all early season management that folks that have overwintered colonies are going to be dealing with. Those of you who are new to beekeeping, this is a lecture that's more geared towards individuals that are, second year or third year students in the program. But you will use this, but it'll be next season if you're not keeping bees. So, with all of these lectures, you're going to have links to these. Hang on to these links. Put a document together. Throw all of the lecture links in there so that you can come back and reference these later on. They will be available on our private YouTube channel in perpetuity, so you'll always have access to these. But for those of you that are going into your second or third year and have overwintered colonies, this is really for you. All right, so the first thing we need to talk about is hives. Do your hives have food? So during this time of the year, a lot of times we can get into a situation where hives starve out. And they starve out because they've just gone through all of the honey over the course of the winter that you left on there for them to stay warm. They're feeding on that honey. They are basically shivering, so they're flexing those flight muscles, and they're basically creating heat by flexing those flight muscles. And so we need to make sure that they still have enough food to make it through this time. Now, if you live in northern Michigan or the Upper Peninsula, this is a critical time for this, because oftentimes if we continue to have cold weather through April and even May, you will run out of food most of the time. And you need to make sure that you have supplemental food on these hives. What this looks like, and you can see from this picture here, this is one of my hives. So it's got two deep hive bodies here on the bottom. This is a 10-frame hive. And then it's got two medium supers on top. Those two medium supers were completely full of honey. Generally, I like to leave somewhere between 100 and 150 pounds of excess honey on my hives for the winter. Now, you can see in this picture, and this is from last year, so you can see that everything's thawed already, but you can see that the cluster is right at the top of this colony. So I took off the top cover, took off the moisture board, and you can actually see the moisture board in the background with a cluster of bees on top of it. But this is where the cluster is located right now. And you can see that they're still clustered. There's no snow on the ground, but they are still clustered because of the temperature that we're at. So we want to make sure that when we see something like this, that we recognize that what this means is that the cluster is at the top of the colony, or the top of the box, and that they have gone through all of those food stores, which has put them in this position. So if I were to open up a colony like this time of the year, the first thing I would do would be to add supplemental sugar. And I'm going to talk to you in this next slide about how we do that. The other way that you can determine if you still have food on the hive, and this is for folks that have been beekeeping a little bit longer, that have gotten a sense of how much stuff weighs, you can literally just go up to the back of the colony and pick it up by one of the handholds and get a really good sense of how much weight's on there. If you've been doing it long enough, you know what it feels like to lift up kind of an entire stack of hive bodies with bees in them, and what that feels like empty, and then what that feels like full. I mean, when you have 100 pounds of honey on this compared to not having 100 pounds of honey on that, the whole stack, essentially, if I were to weigh this out, you're looking at about 75 or 80 pounds in just equipment on a stack like this. But if you were to have an extra 100 pounds on there, it's going to weigh almost 200 pounds. You're going to be able to tell the difference. So that's one easy way to do it without opening the colony. But don't be afraid about opening your colony right now. You can open your colony, and even pretty cold temperatures. I've done supplemental feeding in 30 degrees outside when it was sunny. But you want to make sure that one thing you're not doing is you're not digging into these hives. This is not the time to be doing hive inspections. This is not the time to be breaking that cluster up by pulling out a frame. Do not mess with that cluster. Leave it like it is, add supplemental feed, and wait until we get to warmer temperatures where that cluster is broken up and you don't see them in an orientation like this. So those are a couple ways to check if you have food on the hive. Now, if you don't have enough food on the hive, you're going to feed them sugar. You're going to feed them dry sugar. Again, I know that this has been kind of oftentimes we get kind of weird climate cycles. If it's a warm season, then you may be out of this, and maybe you're well above freezing right now and you want to feed liquid feed. That's fine. But if you're still hitting freezing temperatures, it's not time for liquid feed. You need to be feeding dry sugar. And if you're in the Upper Peninsula this time of the year, you definitely need to be feeding dry sugar. The thought that you would put any moisture on that hive in the form of a liquid feed, that's just not smart. So the main way you're going to do this is you're going to feed dry, and you're going to feed dry sugar. I know lots of folks have these emotional attachments to candy boards. I am not a fan of candy boards, and I'll tell you why. The reason is that candy boards are a mixture of sugar and water. You're adding more moisture to the hive by introducing a candy board. Now, I know they're convenient because it's a solid board that you can just throw in there. But when you're putting dry sugar on in the form of the mountain camp method is what I'm talking about, where you basically put a sheet of newspaper down on top, and you can see in this picture, you can see actually there's a piece of newspaper in that top right corner of the colony. You put a sheet of newspaper down right on top of the frames, and then you just load it with dry sugar. This is a 3-inch spacer here, and I can fit about 5 pounds of sugar on a hive with a 3-inch spacer. So basically what I would do in this situation is that you're going to put a piece of newspaper down, and you're just going to load it with dry sugar right on top of that cluster. That dry sugar, not only is it a food source, but sugar absorbs moisture. And so it is also going to help with moisture wicking. If you have a candy board, it's already saturated. It's not going to give you any moisture wicking potential. Dry sugar will, which is why I prefer dry sugar. Plus, it's just a lot easier. I mean, if you've made candy boards, they are a mess to make. You get you're dealing with sugar. You're trying to get this perfect consistency with water. Oftentimes, you're doing it in the kitchen. It gets messy. Why not just open up a bag of sugar and dump it on top of a colony? That seems a lot easier to me than fussing around with candy boards. Again, no liquid feed until above freezing. It's a good rule of thumb. You know, if the bees aren't flying, you know, regularly, giving them liquid feed is generally not a great idea. Pollen supplement, yes, pollen supplement is something that you likely will need to do because they are going to be rearing brood in large amounts at the beginning of the season after they get past that initial kind of brood rearing. And you want to make sure that you've got supplement on at that time. And so just make sure that, you know, we're kind of off to the races. You see pollen coming in pretty regularly before you start adding pollen substitute. Okay, so moisture. So we got to make sure that our moisture is under control. Now, we're not out of the woods just yet, especially in northern and upper peninsula of Michigan. We've still got a lot of cold in front of us, and moisture is always going to be an issue. And the way that we're getting moisture, like I said earlier, is through bees consuming honey and respiring. So they are putting off a warm, moist air as they're breathing. Now, that warm, moist air, it may not seem like a lot to you when you think about it. Oh, it's, you know, these little bees putting off a little bit of warm, moist air. But you have a group of bees that weighs, you know, somewhere between 10 and 20 pounds as a cluster of bees. You have this big cluster of bees that's putting off this warm air all season long as they're feeding from honey. And so 100 pounds of honey, which is typically what we would leave on a bee colony, 100 pounds of honey fed on over the course of the entire winter will put off the equivalent of about 4 gallons of water. Now, 4 gallons of water is a lot of water. Where does that water go? Well, if you don't have a moisture wicking device, generally it stays right in the colony and creates a ton of moisture in there, which is problematic because you get fungal growth and things like that. In addition, if you don't have any kind of moisture wicking device on that top of the hive, or you have not altered the temperature of the top of the hive by putting some sort of a piece of insulation on there, what you end up with is that top becomes the coldest part of the hive, and that's where the water condenses. If the water condenses on that top portion of the inner cover, it just rains back down onto your cluster and will freeze them out. Wet bees will die in the winter. They have no way to keep themselves dry. So you have to make sure that you're mitigating moisture. The way that we do that is with a moisture board or a quilt box. Now, I am not a fan of quilt boxes just because they seem like a lot of work to me. I've used them in the past. Replacing wood shavings in the middle of the winter is not my idea of fun, but moisture boards are what I prefer. And that's what you see over here in this picture is a moisture board. You can purchase these from all sorts of beekeeping supply companies. You can make them yourself from materials from like Home Depot or Lowe's. But the moisture board is really important because when you're going out there and you're doing inspections this time of the year, and you should be doing inspections, and by inspection, I mean not a full inspection. Like I said earlier, you're not going to be taking any bees out of here. You just need to be peeking into the hive to see what's going on. And one of the things that you should be doing during those inspections is checking your moisture boards or your quilt boxes. Now you can see this moisture board has got water all over it. So this is pretty saturated. And so what I can do at this time of the year is I take that saturated moisture board out and I put a dry one in. And then I can take this saturated one, set it in the house. It's going to dry out in a few days and it's ready to use again. So you can reuse these over and over again. But you need to make sure that those moisture boards and those quilt boxes are dry, because if they get saturated, especially during this time of the year, it's going to lead to problems. So make sure you have enough make sure you have a dry environment inside of that colony, and using one of these devices is the way to do that. All right, so the other thing that you want to make sure that you have going on and this is a technique that we use. Obviously, there's many different approaches to beekeeping, but this is what works for us. And, you know, at MSU, we generally have, you know, generally about a 10% loss. I usually have about a 10% loss in my apiaries as well. So we're well above well below the national average. We're below what's considered sustainable. 15% losses annually is considered a sustainable apiary. So we always want to be shooting for under 15% loss. Now that's a very low amount, especially in modern times, but it can be done with proper management. Just for reference, 40% last year was the annual loss for beekeepers in the United States. So we are way over that at a national average. We need to draw that under. So we've been successful at MSU doing this. This is how we approach things. But again, there are other approaches that may work for this, but I'm just sharing what we do. So what we do in the spring, this is something that's very important. So you don't generally have to wrap hives like right at the first part of the winter. They're not serving a purpose during that time. What we're really wrapping for is for this early part of the spring. So we use 15-pound felt paper, just typical tar paper. You can see how I'm wrapping it here in this picture. You know, you take the roll, you go all the way around the colony, and then you kind of, you know, tuck it in here like a present and put your top cover on. Now you can see I've also got my my spacer up here with my top entrance. That allows me to feed supplemental feed during this time. You can see underneath, right on top of that is the moisture board, and then I've got a piece of pink insulation right on top of that. That's to alter that top temperature to make sure that that is not the coldest part of the hive, but rather the side walls of the hive are the coldest part of the hive. And that means that that moisture accumulates on the sides and runs down. So we don't get into that issue where we have moisture raining down on the colony. The other thing I can point out is you can see that I'm not wrapping this bottom box. The reason for that is the colony is not in the bottom box any longer. It's somewhere up here towards the top at this point in the year. Now, I'm wrapping this colony because I want to allow for the hive itself to accumulate heat. And the reason for that is, and we talked about this earlier when we were talking about the early brood rearing and how the priorities of the hive completely change. They want to stay right on that brood. They're not going to leave that brood. They've got to make sure they maintain temperature of that brood. What this allows is on those sunny days when you're typically going to get a situation where the brood, the cluster can loosen a little bit. So the cluster, for those of you that are unfamiliar with how a cluster works, and we'll talk about this in another lecture, but the cluster is temperature, it responds to temperature. So the colder it is, the tighter the cluster. The warmer it is, the looser the cluster. And so what we're trying to do is we're just trying to accumulate a little bit of heat in the hive on those sunny days so that that cluster can loosen. And so that they're not just so solid on that brood, but rather can loosen enough to where they can take advantage of food resources that may be a little out of reach. So essentially, we're just kind of helping augment the interior temperature of the hive. It's not important during the winter. You don't actually need to do this until, like, I don't know, December or January. This does not have to be a priority going into the winter. I do it in the UP early in the winter because I just don't, by the time we really need this, we've got 3 feet of snow on the ground and it's a pain in the butt to put a wrap around the hive during that time. So we do put these on early in the season in the UP. But in the lower peninsula where you don't get a lot of snow, you can put these on at any time. Up until, you want to have them on by about January. And the reason for that is because as brood rearing starts to come on, we want to make sure that we can accumulate a heat in there. And what this is preventing, it's preventing that starving in place that we talked about earlier. Starving in place where the bees are literally on the brood. They're not going to leave that brood to go find resources somewhere in the hive. And those resources may be a frame or two away, real close, but the cluster is just so tight around that brood that they can't get away. By allowing for heat accumulation in the hive through tar paper, it allows them to loosen that cluster up a little bit. So they're not so solid on the brood. They're able to kind of reach some of those resources that may have been out of reach otherwise. So it helps with prevention of starvation in place. It's really critical during that early part of the season. So February through May, depending on where you're at, it's going to be very critical to that. Okay, so the next thing you want to think about is, do we have bees ordered? So, you may have had some losses, or maybe you're interested in increasing the scale of your apiary and you need to order bees. And you're going to have a lot, there's going to be other videos on this that we're going to provide you with about how to select bees, whether I should do a nuke or a package. But we'll touch on this just real briefly here. So there's two ways you're going to buy bees. Essentially, you're going to buy either nukes, which is a shortened term for a hive nucleus, which essentially means it's a fully functioning 5-frame colony. It has a laying queen, it has capped and uncapped brood, it's got food resources, and it's got a little space to expand. So it is a fully functioning mini bee colony. And this is what you see right here on top is a nuke that I'm installing a mated queen into. So this is from a split. You also can get packages. And so packages are a little bit different. You can think of a package as like just a swarm of bees. Essentially, it's 2 to 3 pounds of bees in a box with a can of sugar and a queen in a cage. And just like this cage that you see here and the cages that you see on this bottom portion here. So the package is going to be a little bit different than Nuke. It's not a fully functioning hive. It is essentially a swarm that has no resources. You're going to be putting them into equipment and they're going to be starting from scratch. So the two options here. And then the next slide, we're going to go through some of the pros and cons of this. Additionally, you need to think about mated queens. So where am I going to supply queens from? So as you're at this time of the year is really important to think about where I'm getting bees from. Generally, you want to have bees ordered by about February. Bees are highly in demand, especially nukes. So nukes are going to be harder to find than packages. But if you can get them, I would always encourage you to purchase nukes, especially if you live in northern climates. If you live in southern climates, nuke or package is I mean, there's advantages and disadvantages to both, but for those of us in northern climates, there's some really critical things that we need to think about when we're selecting packages or nukes. And let's talk about some of these. So what are the pros and cons of packages and nukes? So let's start with nukes. So the pros of a nuke is that it's a fully functioning hive. There's no kind of adjustment period where they have to basically start from scratch, you know, where they're drawing comb immediately before they can actually store resources. They've already got places to store resources. It's already a fully functioning hive. They have food in the form of honey and pollen in there, and they have drawn comb. So again, a fully functioning hive. The queen has places to lay, the colony has places to store food, the colony is fully functioning. The con of nukes is that they are expensive. So they're much more expensive than packages. Typically, packages, boy, they're all over the place nowadays, but somewhere between $120 and $150 usually, whereas nukes, you're looking at 150 plus. And I've seen nukes go for, you know, 250 bucks a nuke. You can, you know, especially during times of the season when these things are sold out, which is generally, you know, right around now or next month. You'll start to see these and it can get much more expensive. They're harder to find. Usually you're going to source them from a local source like your local beekeeping club. And they do have issues with pests. So because it is a fully functioning hive, they will generally bring Varroa in with them because Varroa comes in capped brood. So even if you have somebody that's managing Varroa, you will likely still have Varroa coming in with you. And if you're importing nukes, so say for example, you're getting nukes, say you're in Michigan and you're getting nukes from a southern climate. Here in Michigan, you know, one of the pests that we really don't have a big problem with, but it is a big problem in southern climates, is small hive beetle. So you may get a nuke that has small hive beetle in it, and generally small hive beetle is not much of an issue for us. So you are also going to be importing pests, potentially pathogens as well. So you want to make sure whoever you're purchasing from is a reputable source. Packages. What are the pros of packages? Well, they're less expensive than nukes. They're widely available. You can buy packages online. You can buy packages locally. It is the easiest way to purchase bees. And generally, they're what we could say a term pest-free. So because we're not importing any brood or anything like that with them, generally it's just a swarm. You may have a few phoretic mites on these bees, but it's not going to be, you're not going to have pest issues that come in with them like you would potentially would with a nuke. The cons, well, the big con for us in northern climates is they cannot sustain cold temperatures unless they have drawn frames. So this is really important to understand. In Michigan, in Minnesota, in Wisconsin, in North Dakota, in any of these northern states where we actually have winter and prolonged winters, if you were to take a package that, say, for example, you got in April, and this is something I see all the time in Michigan, no matter what the temperature is, we oftentimes will see people import packages because they're getting them from California or Georgia or Florida or something like that. So they're at a much different time of the year as far as temperature than we are. We will oftentimes see people purchase packages in bulk and bring them to Michigan, usually around April, early April. And sometimes I see folks picking up packages the first week of April. Realistically, we could still be in heavy winter in April in Michigan. If you get a package of bees in early season and maybe it was warm for a couple weeks, but then we dip back down into freezing temperatures for 3 or 4 weeks. That is something that is detrimental to a package. And the reason is that packages cannot cluster on raw foundation. So if you're a new beekeeper and you do not have drawn comb on your foundation, and you install a package into brand new equipment this time of the year where we could still have freezing temperatures, if you have all new equipment, that colony of bees literally cannot cluster, which means they cannot thermoregulate, which means they will die from freezing inside of your colony. And I see this all the time, and I get folks that call me really upset that, hey, Adam, this guy sold me a package of bees that died the first week I had them. And my first question is, one, when did you get them? And two, did you have drawn comb? 99.9% of the time, I got them too early and I did not have drawn comb. It's not the package supplier's fault. They sold you a product. You installed it too early and likely purchased it too early. So knowing as a beginning beekeeper that if you are going to purchase a package early, you have to have drawn comb, and likely you want drawn comb with some food provisions in it as well. So that's a very risky thing. If you are going to install packages, make sure that you are in the clear as far as temperatures are concerned, that you're out of these cold temperatures, because they cannot cluster on it. And like I have on here, in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, I see this all the time. I see folks selling packages in April, and I'm thinking to myself, you are absolutely nuts to be buying a package in April in the Upper Peninsula and thinking you're going to install it in the month of April. That's just not feasible. Generally, late May or June is probably a much better bet, but you can get into some really dicey situations if you install too early. All right, the next thing you want to be thinking about this time of the year is equipment. So you have a great opportunity before things get off to the races to order your equipment, to assemble your equipment if you're assembling your own equipment. And this ensures that there's enough time later in the season to be able to do other things. But you also want to make sure that you have enough equipment for the season. So generally, I like to have at least, so most of you that are small scale, and say if you're 10 or below, you want to have at least one extra setup. One complete extra hive, because you will likely have a swarm at some point. You may have a couple, but having a couple extra setups is not a bad idea. You also want to have a few extra honey supers, because the last thing you want to fall into is if you get to a point in the season where the colony has just gone gangbusters and you run out of supers and you've got to order a super from online and it takes a week to get to you. That week could mean the difference between a swarm or not. So you want to make sure that you're taking advantage of downtime to be able to make sure you have enough equipment for the season. For those of us that have lots of beehives, we run during the season around 50 beehives. I've got hundreds of supers sitting in a garage right now, ready to be used. So you got to make sure that you've got enough to get through the year. This is a good opportunity to fix broken equipment. Don't always throw it away. There's always lots of ways that you can fix broken equipment, even frames. There's, if you have the end of a frame that breaks off, there are repair kits for that. You need to cull old equipment too. So equipment doesn't last forever. That does have a life. Boxes, hive bodies can last quite some time, but frames are something that we need to cull pretty regularly. So frames do over time accumulate things like pesticides in the wax. And really, they do have a life to them. So you want to cull those frames about every 3 to 5 years. Now, you don't have to get rid of the frame itself. We're really talking about the foundation here because it's the wax that really becomes the issue. And you can basically pop foundation out and put a new piece of foundation in a frame. So you don't necessarily have to get rid of it. But don't get attached to frames. You're talking somewhere between $1.25 and $2 a piece for a frame. If you have a frame that looks gross, it's got mold on it, it's got other, slimy stuff on it, maybe from pest problems, get rid of those. You don't get attached to a $2 investment. You can replace a frame very easily. So when we're saying cull your old frames, don't get attached to them. Just make sure that you have good, clean equipment going in. But a good rule of thumb is like every 3 to 5 years. I'm probably more on the 5-year side of things. And generally, I just, when you start to see frames that have just gotten really stained over time, the wax stains over time because of the bees walking over it, we call that travel stain. As those things get darker and darker over time, it's just a good idea, just as a good part of your integrated pest management program to cull those frames. Deadouts. So invariably, you will face this at some point in your career, whether you have or already or not. But deadouts are basically dead hives. So that's the term that we use for a hive that is dead, is a dead out. So you want to remove deadouts from your apiaries as soon as you can. So if you are going through these spring checks or these early spring checks, late winter checks, and you see that hives are dead, you want to clean those out as early as possible. There's a lot of things that come after empty hives. Mice love to make nests in empty hives. There's lots of pests that will get into empty hives, particularly wax moths, that will really cause some issues in a deadout because there are still resources generally available in deadouts. And so that's something that you need to be conscious of. You want to ensure that the frames that you keep as you go through the deadout, you don't have to throw away everything. If you're new to this, you can actually keep most of what you have. But you need to clean it. So you're going to go through each frame by frame, and you're going to make sure that they're clean. And by clean, what I mean is that if there are bees or pollen on there, you need to get rid of them. So pollen is what attracts wax moths. Even though it's called wax moth, Galleria moths are actually attracted to protein. And so it's generally the protein, the pollen, that attracts them. So you need to get rid of those frames that have pollen in them. Whether you just pop out the foundation and put a new fresh piece of foundation in so you can keep the frame, you want to make sure that you're getting that pollen out of there. That is your #1 attractant for wax moths. In addition, old pollen does not have the same nutritional value as fresh pollen. So that old pollen that's been sitting in there for 6 months is not as good as fresh pollen. So, adding a pollen substitute that's fresh is a much better way to feed your bees than trying to feed them old frames of pollen. So get rid of the frames of pollen. Any pollen. I mean, if you have a little chunk of pollen on a frame, get rid of it because it will attract wax moths. The bees, you need to get rid of the bees because they will mold. And so this frame you see here on top, this is a very clear indication that this was a hive that starved, because you see those, when you see butts in the air, basically what that means is that those bees were trying to grab every last single morsel of any kind of food they could find in that frame to be able to survive. And so when we're in this type of a situation, what you can see is that this colony essentially died from starvation. Now you need to get those bees out of there because they will molt. Now you don't have to get rid of the foundation in this situation. You can take your hive tool and just scrape all of that wax off of there that has those bees in there, and then just leave the rest of the wax that doesn't have bees in there. But you need to get rid of the bees. They are going to mold, and those need to go in the trash. Drawn comb should be kept. If it's just drawn comb and it's empty, or even if it has honey in it, it's still good to use. You can use those honey frames this coming season for other colonies, but you need to make sure that they're pulled away. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that the capped honey, even though it's capped, it will accumulate moisture over time. So if you are going to be storing these types of frames, one strategy that you can use is that you can wrap them in kind of like a plastic bag and put them in a chest freezer, and that will help with keeping that moisture down from accumulating in those frames. You want to store the honey that you have that's extra. If there is honey still left in the colony, you want to store those because you're going to likely use them for splits or for feeding another colony later on in the season. All right, so we also need to think about swarm prevention this time of the year. Now, this is a little bit later on into the spring. As we're kind of getting into, say, kind of the April range where temperatures are starting to warm up, we're not getting so many freezing temperatures. But what we're doing is that, we talked about how the colony moves up over time in the colony. So now your colony's gone from being in those bottom brood chambers, and we'll just use this example right here on our picture. So you've got this bottom brood chamber where your bees were at initially. And as we get out of the winter, the bees are now in the top box because they've moved up to feed on resources. One way to prevent early season crowding, meaning that you will get too many bees accumulating in that top box because they're rearing brood up in there. And keep in mind, they are looking for a place to store provisions above the brood chamber. They will always store provisions above. And so make sure that as that colony has gone up, we've got to give them room to be able to put stores on above them. So there's two ways that you can do this. You can do a spring reversal, which is generally the way that I do things, and that's what's in this graphic, where I take my top box, I put it on the bottom, and then I take my bottom box and I put it on the top, and now your cluster is back at the bottom. Now you're oriented correctly. Now, For those of you that are using multiple sizes of boxes, like deeps and mediums, instead of just using one size of box, I have both in my apiary. Some hives we use deeps and mediums. All of our 8-frame equipment, we just use mediums. So it's not much of an issue with there. But if you were dealing with this, you switch this over. Keep in mind that this is now your brood chamber at the bottom, and this is now your honey storage. Or in this situation, if you were to manage this as 2 boxes, this could just be your brood chamber. But essentially, you're giving them an opportunity where you're moving that top box down to the bottom, and it frees up all that space above them to store things in. And that's how you prevent swarms. Swarming, a lot of times, I mean, there's different impulses for swarming. It is the natural reproduction method of honeybees as a colony, but swarming is oftentimes stimulated by too many bees in one space. So essentially, it's a lack of space is one of the main triggers for swarming. So if there's not enough places to store food, lay eggs, that is one of the stimulants for swarming. And so that's what we're trying to augment here, is we're trying to give them more space to lay, more space to store food so that they don't swarm early in the season. The other way that you can do this is you can just add supers. So you could just, and like in this graphic here, you could just start adding more supers on top of this and not worry about the spring reversal. That is an approach that many beekeepers use. But one thing you need to be aware of is when you start hitting this later part of the spring, there is going to be rapid growth. It's not like the beginning of the season where they put on a small cluster of brood to get things kind of going. You will see full frames of brood during that time of the season. And you have to be ready for that, meaning you've got to have equipment ready so that you can add supers when they need to be added. You're not saying, oh, shoot, I'm running out of space. I've got to order my supers from Man Lake. No, you need to have those supers already in place. The bees are not going to wait for you. They are livestock. They are not going to wait for your agenda. You need to be ready to meet their agenda. So just be prepared for rapid growth during that time of the year. All right, so as your colonies are building up, you're getting these big brood chambers. Now it is the time to start thinking about splits. Now we have an entire lecture on splits, so I'm not going to go through these very, very in depth, but I just want you to be aware, and we have splits workshops coming up, so we'll be able to do this in person as well. But one of the things you need to be aware of is that splits are something that you're going to be doing. You're going to turn one hive essentially into many hives. Not only does this give you the opportunity to increase the size of your apiary, this is how we sustainably increase the size of our apiaries through splits of overwintered colonies, but it also helps preventing swarms because you're taking off some of that pressure as far as population pressure on that colony. So by removing a portion of the colony, you're freeing up space with the original colony. In addition, this is something that we should all be thinking about. We should be selling nukes to our community. So part of being a beekeeper is contributing to the beekeeping community. And by selling local nukes is one way to do that. By selling local nukes, not only are you helping people in your area, you are also limiting the amount of imported bees into Michigan or into your state, because you are providing in-state bees. So one of the reasons that we cannot get a handle on pests and pathogens as far as transmission is concerned within the beekeeping industry is because we move bees all over the place. We are bringing bees from out of state. We're bringing bees from some states that have pests that we don't really have an issue with. I talked about small hive beetle earlier. All of this stuff is getting moved around the country. If we can prevent any kind of movement or importation of bees into our area by creating nukes, that is a good thing. So you want to make sure that you're participating in that. All right, so your considerations for splits. And again, this is going to be a very truncated version of splits. There's several different types of splits available. I'm going to talk about a couple. The walkaway the walkaway split is really, well, that's the one I'm going to be talking about. So we're going to talk about a 5-frame split and as a walkaway and or as adding a mated queen. And then we're going to talk about just basically what we call a typical split, which is where we basically just split a hive in 2. So we're going to talk about both of these. The big thing to keep in mind is that you're going to have, if you're doing a split early in the season, especially in northern climates, you're going to have to purchase a mated queen. You can't early in the season, especially when we're talking like April, you can't just expect them to be able to rear a queen and that queen get mated if it's too early in the season, because if drones are not available to mate with, that queen will not mate. And if she doesn't get out of that hive within like 3 to 5 days to mate, she will not mate. And so you'll have a queen that will just fail. So you need to make sure that if you are going to be asking your colony to raise a queen, that they have what they need to actually be successful, which means that there has to be drones present. So early in the season, we generally don't see a lot of drones. So you want to purchase a mated queen from somebody. Now here in Michigan, that means that it's not going to be from Michigan most of the time. It's going to be imported from either California or Georgia. And mated queens are a little bit different. It's not like importing, a whole colony. You're literally importing a queen and like 3 or 4 attendants. So it's a much different situation than importing an entire colony. But mated queens are going to be ready to go. It means that they've been mated in California or another state, and they are ready to start laying. So they don't have to go out and do a mating flight. If you do a walkaway with no queen, that is raising their own queen, that's what walkaway means. It means you make the split and you walk away and let them take care of the queen rearing. So if you're doing that, you just got to make sure that there's drone present so that that queen can actually mate. Again, if she doesn't mate with the first few days, she will not mate, and she will fail. So that is one thing that I see a lot of folks struggle with splits, is that they make splits early in the season without adding mated queens. They just want them to raise their own queens, and they oftentimes will fail because the temperatures just won't allow. And not only is it that drones may not be present, if drones are present but the weather is bad, say you get 2 weeks of rain, she will fail. So you've got to make sure, the best and safest way to do an early season split is with a mated queen. All right, so the 5-frame split, and we're just going to cover this real quickly. A 5-frame split is literally just taking 5 frames from an existing colony that have certain resources and putting them into a new box. So the first thing you're going to want is a frame of eggs. The reason that we want a frame of eggs is because we want that next generation of bees on deck, ready to go, so that when they've been laid, 21 days later, we're going to have that workforce hatch out. In addition, we want to have frames of emerging brood as well. The emerging brood is going to be your nurse bees that are going to take care of those eggs as they're being reared through the larval stage and going into their pupal stage. In addition, you want to have a frame of food, so pollen and honey. We want to make sure that they have the pollen to rear brood and the honey for those carbohydrates. And then you're going to have kind of a food frame, open frame that's going to have food provisions, but is also going to have room for expansion as well. This right here is a fully functioning colony once you add that mated queen to it. And so you were going to add, and we had that in that earlier picture, you saw that queen cage. You would just purchase that queen in that cage. You would put it into this colony, and I'll show you how to do this once we get to that portion of our lecture, because this lecture is really for those students that have already kind of have a little bit of experience and have overwintered hive. But for those of you that are new, in this stage, we would add the mated queen, and we would put that mated queen kind of right here in this brood chamber in the cage. And so they're in this cage, and one end of the cage has a candy plug and the other one does not. You take off the cork end on the candy plug end and you face that end down. The other thing you want to make sure is the screen that's on the front of on the top of the cage is facing out. It's not facing into the frame. So the last thing you want is that open portion of it to be smashed into the frame, into the wax of the frame, because the bees that are in the colony still need to have access to that queen. So they're getting familiar with her. Generally, you're going to leave her in the cage for a couple days, and then you're going to either release her if she hasn't gotten out already, or they've already released her by eating through the candy plug. But that's kind of the short end of that. So that's the 5-frame split. The other split is the typical split, and this is really an easy split to do. So essentially, this is your colony. So you have your cluster in there. You've got 2 boxes that you have brood in. So you've allowed this colony to grow up. And now it's 2 boxes worth of bees and brood and all the good stuff that goes along with that, food, resources, and space. And essentially what you're going to do is you're just going to take the top box, put it on a bottom board and add a top cover to it, and the bottom box and put it on a bottom board and add a top cover to it. You're going to leave this for 3 days. And you're going to come back in 3 days, and one of them is going to have eggs and the other one is not. The one that has eggs in it is the one that has the queen in it. And so at that point, then you get your mated queen and you add your mated queen to the hive that does not have eggs in it. And that's how you make a typical split. Very easy. You don't even have to look for the queen in this one. Whereas the other one, the 5-frame one, and I should have said that, this one, you want to make sure your queen's not in here from the original hive. You want to, as you're building this, you're taking one frame out at a time. You want to make sure you identify where the queen is, and you don't want to add her to this. That queen remains in that original colony. Whereas this one, it doesn't matter what box she's in because you're going to be able to tell which one she's in 3 days. So that's your typical split. And again, there's your queen cage right there. And that's, you can see on this one, this is the candy plug that I was talking about right there. So the bees will either eat through that to get to her. But I will say this, when you introduce mated queens, 50% of the time, they do not release the queen, meaning they do not make it through that candy plug. And a lot of times you will have a queen die in the cage if they do not get through that plug in a few days. So your responsibility as a beekeeper, they only need about 48 to 72 hours to get familiar with her queen pheromone so that they don't kill her. So leave her in there a couple days, but make sure you check on her after those couple days. And if she's not out, you're going to release her manually, meaning you're going to just pop this screen off and you're just going to let her walk down into the colony. All right, our summary for today. So bees are fed and dry should be one of your main priorities right now during this time of the season. You want to make sure that there's supplemental food if they need it. And you also want to make sure that your moisture wicking device, whether it's a quilt box or a moisture board, is in good working order. If they're saturated, you need to replace them. Hives are wrapped, so you've got black tar paper around your hives to make sure that they can accumulate heat inside of the hive and allow that cluster to expand a little bit during that brood rearing phase early in the season. You want to make sure your equipment's ready so that you've got it all ordered, assembled, ready to go, and that you've got a little bit of excess for the season. You want to make sure your bees are ordered. So you've got those bees in line, ready to come to your farm at a reasonable date. Again, if you're in the Upper Peninsula, I would not encourage you to buy packages in April. That's a losing recipe right there. So make sure you understand that depending on where your climate you are in relation to climate, that you are making the right decisions. Again, packages cannot cluster on raw foundation. They have to have drawn comb. The last thing you want to make sure is that you have a plan for splits, making sure that you know where you're going to get your queens from and getting some sort of a timeline on. One of the things that you are going to be very aware of if you are not a farmer and you are getting into beekeeping, meaning that you're not, you haven't not worked in agriculture before, is that your best friend is going to be your weather app on your phone. You should be looking at that at all times. Do not make management decisions without referring to weather. And the reason is that because you could install packages today and we could have a snowstorm tomorrow and that package will be dead. You want to make sure that you're looking a couple weeks out as far as temperature is concerned so that you understand that you're making the right decisions based on the climate, based on the temperature. And that's really important. So if you don't have a weather app on your phone, download it. Also, I would encourage downloading a radar app as well, because particularly in Michigan, our weather is very volatile. And you need to make sure that you understand what's going on in the weather and that you are treating your bees appropriately based on those temperatures and those weather patterns. So make sure when you're thinking about doing a plan for splits that you're taking into consideration what the weather is going to look like. Again, if you were to do a walkaway split, even with drones present, and you had a week of rain after that queen emerged, she is going to not mate, and that will become a queenless colony very quickly, just because she couldn't get out of the hive. And that's something to be very, very conscious of. All right, so that is our lecture for today on preparing for spring, those overwintered colonies, getting them ready for spring. I'll look forward to chatting with you at the next lecture. Thanks again.